And now last presentation in this session, Professor Ryan Smith from Colorado State University. And we will talk about subsidence in California. Already we've got introduction done by Michelle in the morning. Please.
Great, thank you. I apologize, first of all, for my very boring slide. There's no pictures or anything. I'm kind of a bland person, so it fits my personality. So I also first wanted to thank the organizers. This symposium has been amazing. If there's too much feedback, I can switch the microphone. So much really cool research going on, and I feel very working at Colorado State. There's other good people there, but feel a little isolated working in subsidence and coming here and seeing all these people doing all these amazing things. So it's been really great. So again, thank you to the organizers. So has anyone seen this photo? So clearly a very famous photo representing land subsidence in the San Joaquin Valley, so 9 meters of subsidence. And Michelle gave a really good background on what has been happening here this morning. So I've highlighted the location here in and like Michelle was showing, in the western portion of the San Joaquin Valley, where there was a lot of historic subsidence, but not a lot of recent subsidence. And this has been highlighted by a number of people doing different INSAR studies. It was highlighted pretty clearly by Estelle Chaussard when she did some independent component analysis in the valley that highlighted or that identified regions with a lot of inelastic deformation and also regions with more elastic deformation. And it was interesting for me reading this paper and seeing, you have a lot of inelastic deformation like we kind of knew in this portion of the valley, and then a little up here as well, and very little inelastic over here. And so interesting. There's some different reasons why that might be the case. And again, we got some of the background on that. We had some surface water coming into that portion of the valley starting in the 60s, I believe. So that's part of the story. We could also have, there's a few other reasons why we could have less deformation there right now, right? So there's been a lot of consolidation there. So maybe these clays are just really over consolidated and there's not a lot of potential for future consolidation. We have lower water demand, so maybe drawdowns there are just, maybe the water levels are just totally stabilized. And then maybe we have a really low pre-consolidation head and we're just not low enough yet in our current round of drawdowns. So the goal of this study is to kind of explore those questions and to do it with a model. And so we had two different areas here. I had an undergrad, I had an undergrad student helping me with this project a couple years back, and he didn't want to be included on this. So anyways, so this region, the area of high historic subsidence and very little recent subsidence, and then this region, Pixley-Tulare, that had pretty significant historical subsidence and even more recent subsidence, getting up to 25, 30 centimeters per year over the past decade or so. So those are the two different areas we chose to model, and we're doing more regional subsidence models, so kind of average subsidence over those whole areas. Okay, so some things that we need. We need observations of subsidence to help us calibrate our model. We need an estimate of the vertical distribution of head within our clay layers so we can simulate the subsidence. And then we need estimates for our hydrologic and our geomechanical properties, right? So we'll talk first about observations. Poland did a lot of great work on historical subsidence measurements. There's extensometers, there's leveling surveys. For the purposes of this study, we're looking at more regional subsidence rather than point-based, so we use the leveling surveys that have roughly every 5 years or so, they have an estimate of regional subsidence over both of the areas that I showed you. And then we have INSAR, and we use data from Trey Altamira that's available over the entire Central Valley. And we've had a lot of discussion here about INSAR, and I think most people are very familiar with it, but allow me to give a little bit of background here. It'll come back in a minute. You'll see why I'm going into this level of detail. So SBAS is a really common technique we use with INSAR to get a nice time series that reduces our noise, right? So as a really simple example, let's say we have 4 acquisitions. We're getting phase from each and we can get then the change in phase as an interferogram between all of these acquisitions. So in this example, we end up with 6 interferograms, and what we're really trying to get now is the deformation, well, the change in phase that becomes the deformation between each of these individual time steps. So 1, 2, 3. So we want to get 3 estimates of deformation, and we have 6 measurements. So that's a nice problem, right? We have more data than we need. It's overdetermined, and that helps us reduce some of our noise. And so we do this with lots and lots of interferograms, and we can produce very robust data sets that reduce some of the tropospheric and other sources of noise we might get in the interferograms. Okay, so we'll come to that in a second here, why I gave that background for those that maybe be a little less familiar with what SPAS is. Okay, so now we need an estimate of vertical distribution of head within clay layers, and this part is a little bit trickier. So first we need historical head in the coarse-grained aquifer itself, and that acts as a boundary when we're doing our modeling of the clay layer. And the challenge here, there's a number of challenges. For those that have worked in the San Joaquin Valley, the head data are not great by and large. There's some really nice measurements, but a lot of it's kind of messy. And we also don't have records that span this time period. And so one option would be to say, well, we do have a lot of historical head measurements, so let's just take, when we're looking at regional subsidence, right? So we'll take the whole area and take the average head within the area during each year of the study, and that'll give you your time series or the average depth of groundwater. You could do that, but the locations where they're monitoring head is changing over time, and the depth intervals are changing over time. So you get these weird shifts where if they change the network, then you get all of a sudden a 5-meter jump in head or a 5-meter drop in head that's not representing what's actually happening in the system. And so the approach here instead was to do a variation of SPAS, but with head measurements, right? So we take change in head at individual wells where we have a head record maybe of just 5 years or 10 years, 15 years. And we can get change in head from 1940 to 1955 or 1940 to 1945. So we end up with all these measurements of change in head that we can put together across the whole valley. All these, and I can't show all the equations you get, but you get over 500 equations and like 82 unknowns. So right, so you could solve that system of equations to get your change in head. And this is a visual representation of what those equations look like with the duration between measurements. And this is a visual representation of our interferograms that we're making with head, change in head rather than change in phase. So we get this matrix, so we invert the matrix to solve for the yearly change in head, and that's shown right here. And then we integrate that to get the cumulative change in head that's averaged over each of our study areas. And what this did is it gave us a much less noisy record of change in head over time. Okay, so if you saw Matt Lee's talk yesterday, he gave a really nice background on modeling the groundwater flow within these clay layers, and my approach is very similar. We use the 1D groundwater flow equation to simulate the distribution over time and vertical space within clay layers, and then simulate deformation with varying constants depending on if it's elastic or inelastic. We did include we allowed SSK and K to vary as a function of effective stress and porosity, because it's such a long time period that it's very likely that you're going to have a decrease in those parameters over time, similar to what Matt saw in a different part of the valley. Okay, then we did estimates for our parameters, right? Our geomechanical and our hydrologic parameters. And these we parameterized. So we ran about 40,000 simulations, and we took the models that were within a certain percentage of the error to get our final result. Okay, so what we're looking at here on the top, we have the western area of the valley where the Poland picture is. And this is averaged across that whole region. So where Poland was standing was the area with the most subsidence. This is averaged across the whole region, so the magnitude is a little bit, it's less. And then this is the area, the Pixley-Tulare area that has a lot more recent subsidence. And we've got head records on the left and deformation on the right. So you can see that we're fitting both the historical and the recent deformation measurements pretty well. And you can also see just from looking at these head records, we had a huge drawdown in the western San Joaquin Valley, and then a huge rebound where we almost got all the way back to what we were at in the 40s, followed by some periodic periods of drawdown and recovery. Whereas in the Tulare Pixley area, there's a very dramatic recent drawdown. Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the effect of consolidation on deformation. So I ran two models then. One model so the main model was assuming this time varying parameters. Another model held them constant with time. And this shows the difference between those models in both study areas. And it's a little easier to see if you take the derivative of deformation, which is here on the bottom. And you can see that towards the end of the study period, we're getting about 25% less deformation, less subsidence in both areas if we let those parameters decrease as a function of effective stress and porosity. So it's definitely having an effect, and it needs to be considered for modeling future scenarios. However, even if you take that away, it doesn't fully explain. So there would still be subsidence in this area if we were dropping below the pre-consolidation head. And you can see that here where we're above the lowest head that the aquifer has experienced, and we're kind of getting close to it, kind of flirting with it. I took the past 30 years and said if we projected that out and assumed that those same rates of drawdown continue for the next 20 years, then this is what the head time series would look like for both areas. And you can see that the projected deformation then shown in the dashed line goes from being fairly flat relative to what it was to really more dramatic subsidence as we get really far below that pre-consolidation head. There was a really interesting talk yesterday about pre-consolidation head in Texas, and I made this slide after I saw that because I thought it was kind of fun. In the model, we're seeing that once we get up to the late 1970s, there's still inelastic deformation for a while, and then we get up here, and then it slows down, and there's not much at all. And then, like Michelle mentioned, you get a sharp drop in head during a drought year, and then it goes up again. So you get it's a little hard to see here, but you get a little more inelastic deformation, and then it again flattens out. And this is, as you saw it earlier today, the extensometer data show that as well. So it's a useful concept of this head where it's above the lowest level the aquifer has experienced, but there's some sublayers within these clays that haven't experienced that yet. And so if we get below that, we're going to get some, but not as much inelastic deformation. And so if we continue this out to after the 1990s, we go below it again, and again we see an increase in inelastic deformation. And then fast forward again, we're getting below it more consistently, and we're starting to get some more inelastic deformation, but it's not huge yet, right? Once we get below what the aquifer itself has experienced, then the whole clay will be deforming, and we should expect a lot more inelastic deformation. Okay, so let's go back to potential reasons why this area has had less subsidence recently. So we talked about how the clays are over-consolidated, there's lower water demand, and the pre-consolidation head. And hopefully I've shown you, I mean, all of these are playing a role for sure. But the biggest driver is hitting that pre-consolidation head. We're kind of flirting with it right now, but as we get really safely below it, well, not safe, but as we get further below it, we can expect to get a lot more subsidence. Okay, so we've heard a lot about the San Joaquin Valley in western US. I just wanted to broaden our horizons a little bit here to close. So there's subsidence in other parts of the US besides the San Joaquin Valley, believe it or not. And we took some similar principles here, and we're looking in the southwest Utah, Parowan Valley, which is a nice area to study because we actually do have pretty good pumping data and some really good cooperators, local water managers. So we have some reasonably good data sets here. You see there's a big seasonal rebound in this area, seasonal decline and rebound, but you're also getting an inelastic deformation component here we did some similar 1D modeling here. And one thing I wanted to highlight is that every season you're dropping below this level where inelastic deformation starts to dominate again. And as you get to there again, there's a part of the clay layer that hasn't experienced that head level yet, right? So we're seeing sort of a seasonal inelastic deformation. Okay, and I want to talk about, so as we're looking into the future and we're the goal, we talked about sigma, and this is the case for many basins throughout the US and the world, where the goal is to stabilize our water levels, right? Well, once we stabilize those water levels, we will stop getting, eventually we'll stop getting subsidence. And once we stop getting subsidence, we'll stop getting water out of clays that are coming into the aquifer. So we did a little study here where we had pumping and head, and so we were able to get a decent estimate of net inflow into the aquifer. We used that to then estimate aquifer storage loss, which is this red line right here. And then we also estimated the storage loss within the fines, within the clays, and that's this green line right here. So the main takeaway is they're similar magnitude. We're losing similar amounts of water from the coarse-grained and the fine-grained materials. But as we become more sustainable and stabilize those water levels, this red line will flatten out, and eventually the green line will flatten out. And if we raise our water levels, then the green line will flatten out faster. And then we'll stop getting that water from the clays. And then that's a flux that we haven't really accounted for. And so just something to think about as we're thinking about sustainable implementation of these data sets, or of these groundwater basins. And then I just want to give a quick plug to my PhD student, Joaquin. We're often, so in this same valley, we're often trying to get better estimates of clays, right, as those are driving subsidence. So he took this system out that we have at CSU where it's a ground-based time domain electromagnetic system. You have this airborne that's been flown in different parts of the country and the world as well. But with that, we're able to map out the clays with pretty good detail and then relate that to ongoing subsidence. Okay, so wrapping things up, kind of ending where we started. I hope I've convinced you that the low preconsolidation head in the western part of the San Joaquin Valley is what's really driving these lower rates of subsidence. And while we have some inelastic deformation now, we can expect a lot more in the future if we continue in that same western region at the same rates of drawdown that we have had for the past 30 years. And that these subsidence data can be a really valuable tool, not just for looking at subsidence by itself, but for looking at water budgets, particularly in these confined basins. And so let's hope that we don't have to take another photo of this telephone pole in another 20, 40 years. But I was just thinking, if we did have to take that picture, 40 years from now, hopefully by then, I'll be retired. So who could be the person? I thought, Matt Lees would be a great person to be in that photo. But hopefully we don't have to take it, but that's just my pitch for Matt. Thank you.
Thanks. Great, really great presentation. And questions? Yeah?
Yeah, well, your ending perfectly leads into my question. I hope you're right, but I'm fearful that you're wrong, because something that occurred to me looking at your head data, and again, it occurred to me during Michelle's talk, is that the head in this western area is jolly near where it got to back in the 60s and 70s. In fact, I think it's there. It's at its pre-consolidation head or thereabouts. Are you worried that the subsidence in the west might be about to accelerate if this doesn't change? If there's one more drought, it would be my guess.
Yeah, so that was exactly the point I was trying to make, that if we project in turquoise here, if we project the drawdowns we've been seeing for the past 30 years, we project those into the future for the next 20 years, we see the subsidence going from moderate, a little bit, to really increasing. So certainly, yeah, I mean, it's not a good outlook, but so yeah, I agree.
Thanks. Who was first?
Thanks. Thanks very much for your presentation. And there is something that's been bothering me during the conference, so I need to get it out of my chest before we all go home. And that's that the pre-consolidation level, of course, is very important, because it's, as was just said, that if you're very close, then you can maybe get If you're over it, you get extra inelastic land subsidence. But you didn't. I think you didn't model this with a creep model, right? With creep based. But because if you do that, then even before the pre-consolidation level, already you can have inelastic, increasing inelastic rates, and that will be very important to see that in this case.
Yeah, I'm glad you got off your chest. I was hoping we get a question about creep, because it's true. I did not simulate creep, and I would welcome discussions on this, for sure. I was just at an interesting poster today that was showing creep as a function of organic material and density, and it was showing that for this lab result that there was much lower creep as you were getting to the density ranges of clay that we're seeing here, where we're like 100, 200 meters below ground surface. On top of that, if you look at the extensometers, it flattens out in the 80s. So whether is it flattening out because there was creep, but then your effective stress increases, and so it gets really tough to say for sure. And I don't think we should neglect creep, but at the same time, I think there are there's some indicators that what the model is saying in terms of when subsidence is flattening out is supported by the observations.
Sure. Yeah. Really interesting case though to see what you could do with the creep model and how it will work out. Yeah,
certainly.
And last question, okay?
That's right. Thanks, Ryan, for this very interesting talk. At the start, you did something I haven't seen that before. So you used INSAR to derive your hydraulic head.
No. Sorry.
Please correct me.
Yeah.
Because,
so I set it up with INSAR as like the parallel approach, right? But I was using actual water level measurements from wells, but it was a similar method to INSAR where you have maybe, say there's a well where you have a measurement in 1940 and then nothing for 5 years, then one in 1945. And so that's like an interferogram where you have an acquisition in that time period, then an acquisition later. And then the matrix you set up is similar to how you would run SPAS. So yeah, sorry if there was confusion there.
Yeah, that's thanks.
Thank you one more time.